Preface and Introduction of The Speaking Voice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The Speaking Voice. Principles of Training, Simplified and Condensed by Katherine Jewell Everts. Preface. This little book on voice is the result of its author's observation, first in the college and social world, and later as reader, teacher, and actress, of the crying need in each and all of these circles for some simple and practical instruction in the training of the speaking voice. There are volumes of recognized authority, considerable in length and exhaustive in detail, which one who intends to use his voice professionally should master, if possible, but which it is almost impossible for the college, society, or business man or woman to study and follow, from sheer lack of time. This book offers a method of voice training which is the result of a deliberate effort to simplify and condense, for general use, the principles which are fundamental to all recognized systems of vocal instruction. It contains practical directions accompanied by simple and fundamental exercises, first for the freeing of the voice, and then for developing it when free. Careful study of these directions and faithful practice of these exercises for 15 minutes a day will do much toward converting our high-pitched, harsh, hard American instrument of torture into the low-toned, efficient agent of personality it was intended by nature to be. To Dr. S. H. Clarke of the University of Chicago, and to Dr. S. S. Curry of the School of Expression in Boston, I wish to express my gratitude for the inspiration to this task which their books have given me. To Mr. George W. Ferguson of Berlin, and to Miss Caroline V. Smith of the State Normal School of Minnesota, I am deeply indebted for personal instruction in the training of my own instrument. My especial gratitude is due to my first teacher, Mrs. Lenora Austin Hamlin of Chicago, who at a critical moment saved my voice for such work as it has had the honor to carry on since my study with her. And to my last teacher, Mr. J. W. Parson Price, who has recently rescued it for further efforts in the field of vocal interpretation. Katherine Jewell Everts. Plan of the book. The voice throughout the book is treated as an instrument of expression, with a technique just as necessary to master as the technique of the piano, violin, or any other musical instrument. But before the study of technique can be safely entered upon, the instrument must be put in tune, so the work falls naturally under 3 heads, and the book is divided accordingly into 3 parts, as follows. Part 1. The tuning of the instrument. Chapter 1. Learning to support the tone. A. Directions. B. Exercises. Chapter 2. Learning to free the tone. A. Directions. B. Exercises. Chapter 3. Learning to reinforce the tone. A. Directions. B. Exercises. Part 2. The technique of the instrument. Chapter 1. Discussion. Chapter 2. Study in change of pitch. Chapter 3. Study in inflection. Chapter 4. Study in tone color. Part 3. Studies in the vocal interpretation of literature. Chapter 1. The law of approach. Chapter 2. The essay. Chapter 3. The fable. Chapter 4. Lyric poetry. Chapter 5. Didactic poetry. Chapter 6. The short story. Chapter 7. Epic poetry. Chapter 8. The dramatic monologue and the play. Introduction. Next to that primary instinct, the instinct for self-preservation, the strongest impulse of the human heart is for self-expression. The failure of society to provide simple and natural means of self-preservation has led to the American anarchist. The failure of education to provide for the training of the simple and natural means of self-expression has led to the American voice. We cram the student's mind with a knowledge of beauty and truth, but do not free the channels of communication and expression through which, in the act of sharing the knowledge he has acquired, the student assimilates and recreates that beauty and truth, and finds it a vital force in his soul life and a vital index of his culture. How many of us would waste the time we do waste in idle gossip if we knew we could adequately express half the worthwhile ideas we conceive but dare not utter because our instruments are out of tune and we know they will betray us? What musician would consent to play on a piano which had not been put in perfect tune? Our first step, then, is to tune the instrument, to put the voice in proper condition for use, to learn to support, free, and reinforce the tone which is to be converted later, not into slovenly, careless gossip, but into beautiful and effective speech. End of the introduction. Chapter 1 of the Speaking Voice. Principles of Training, Simplified and Condensed, by Katherine Jewell Everts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1. The Tuning of the Instrument. Chapter 1. Learning to Support the Tone. Before attempting the exercises involved in the first step, let us examine a tone in the making, or rather, let us feel how it is made. For the process of tone production, so far as it concerns us, is not of physiological but rather psychological significance. The huge tomes on the physiology of the voice, which are of vital interest to the student of anatomy, are not only of no use, but are apt to be a positive hindrance to the student of vocal training. A vivid picture of the larynx or vocal cords, a cross-section of the trachea, or a highly illuminated image of any of the cavities concerned in the production of that most wonderful thing in the world, a pure tone of the human voice, is a source of delight to the physiologist, but will only interfere with that feel for the free, full volume of sound which the student of voice as an instrument of thought and emotion is to make as a first step in vocal training. Then, not as anatomists or physiologists, but as makers of music, let us feel for a tone. I am stung by the splendour of a sudden thought. I desire to share it with you. The desire causes me to take a deep breath. A column of air rises, is converted into tone, passes into the mouth, and is moulded into the words which symbolize my thought. Let us, without further analysis, try this. Close your eyes. Think of some line of prose or poetry which has moved you profoundly. Let it take possession of you until you are seized by the desire to voice it. Still with closed eyes, feel yourself take the breath which is to be made into tone, and then into the words which stand for the thought. Hold that sensation, and study it with me for a moment. But, you say, the desire to voice the thought does not seize me. Very well, let me ask you a question. Do you like growing old? Now, your thought was converted so swiftly into speech that you had no time to study the conversion. Once more, whether your answer be the "Yes" of 16 or the "No" of 30, close your eyes and feel for the tone you are to use in making the single word "Yes" or "No." Now, a little more in detail, let us see what happens. A thought full of emotion meets the question. The desire to answer is born. The need of breath to meet the desire contracts the diaphragm, the pump. The chest, the reservoir, fills. A column of air, pumped and controlled by the diaphragm, and reinforced in the chest, rises, strikes the vocal cords, the strings of the instrument. The strings vibrate, converting the air into sound, into tone. The tone, reinforced in all the chambers of the head, passes into the mouth, and is there moulded by the juxtaposition of the organs of speech, lips, teeth, tongue, into the word. The single monosyllabic word yes or no, which frames the thought. Now, once more with closed eyes, sense the process and hold the sensation, but do not speak the word. Now, still once more, and this time speak. Alas, did we say we were makers of music? Is this harmony, this harsh, hard, breathy, strident note? What is the trouble? First of all, fundamental to all, and beyond a doubt the secret of the dissonance, you did not breathe before you spoke, or as you spoke. I mean really breathe. And that is the first point to be attacked. Breathe, breathe, breathe. You must learn how to breathe. You must get your pump, your diaphragm, into working order. You must master it. You must control it. You must not fetter it. You must give it a free chance to do its work. If you are a man, you have probably at least been fair in not tying down your pump. You have not encased yourself in steel bands and drawn them so tight that your diaphragm could not descend and perform its office. Yes, and if you are the athletic girl of to-day, you have probably learned the delight and benefit of free muscular action. But you may still be suffering from the effect of your mother's crime in this direction. It may have sent you into the world with weakened muscles in control of the great pumping station upon which must depend the beauty of your voice. But, whatever the condition or the cause, it must, if wrong, be made right. We must learn to breathe properly, freely, naturally. Do not confuse naturally and habitually. In this connection, these terms are opposites rather than synonyms. To breathe naturally, we must do away with all constriction. We must choose between the alleged beauty of a disproportionately small waist and the charm of a beautiful and alluring voice. We cannot have both. Then off with tight corsets. Thank heaven they are the exception and not the rule to-day. Please note that I distinctly do not say off with corsets, but only off with ill-fitting corsets, for which tight is but another name. I believe, to digress a moment, with our present method of dress, a properly fitted corset is an absolute necessity, except in the rare instances where a perfectly proportioned and slender figure is also under the control of firm, well-trained muscles. In a first flush of rapture over the vision of the gentle ladies of Mr. Howell's Altruria, seen through the eye of the needle, we feel that we can take a step toward that paradise by discarding the straight-laced, tailored torture the present-day costume prescribes, for the corsetless grace of the Altrurian garment. But our enthusiasm is short-lived, as we realize that we are in modern America, and must make as inconspicuously gracious an appearance as possible, without violating the conventions. So, as I say, do not discard the corset, which is, for the majority of women, the saving grace of the present fashion in dress. Only see that your corset brings out what is best in the figure God gave you, instead of disfiguring it, as undue constriction of any part of your body will inevitably do. Incidentally, by this precaution, save your voice as well. But until we can be refitted or readjust the corsets we already wear, and the gowns made over them, We must avoid the discouraging effect of trying to work against the odds of a costume which interferes with our breathing, by making a practice of taking the breathing exercises involved in the first step, at night and in the morning. 5 minutes of deep, free breathing from the diaphragm, lying flat on your back in bed at night and before you rise in the morning, will accomplish the desired result. The point in lying flat on your back is that in that position alone you can be sure you are breathing naturally, which is diaphragmatically. Indeed, you cannot, without great effort, and sometimes not even then, breathe any other way than naturally. I cannot tell you why. I can only say, try it and see. Our first exercise, then, is to lie flat on the back at night and in the morning, when you are perfectly free, and with closed eyes take deep, long breaths, letting them go slowly, and studying the accompanying sensation until it is fixed fast and you feel you cannot lose it, but can reproduce, under any condition, the action which resulted in that sensation. The incidental effect of this exercise is to make one very sleepy. Indeed, nothing will so quickly and effectually put to flight that foe of the society woman and business man of to-day, insomnia, as the practice of deep, regular, natural breathing. Add counting each respiration, and it is an almost unfailing remedy. The only trouble for our purpose is that it is sometimes so swiftly soporific that we are asleep before the sensation is fixed fast and noted in consciousness, which is one object of the exercise. However, should we find the prescribed 5 minutes at night interfered with by coming drowsiness, we may yield in sleepy content, sustained and soothed by the thought that we shall be in splendid shape for the morning practice, with which nothing must interfere, not headache or sciatica or leprosy or thunderstroke. We are ready now for the third exercise. When for 5 minutes in the morning, lying flat on your back with closed eyes, you have taken deep, long breaths, letting them go slowly, yielding your whole body to the act of respiration, noting the effect and fixing fast the sensation, as a next step you are to stand up and repeat the operation. Still holding the sensation, not by tightening your muscles or clenching your fists or setting your teeth, but simply by thinking the sensation, letting it possess you. In this attitude of mind, breathe naturally, standing instead of lying down. That is all. Don't be discouraged if the test prove unsatisfactory at first. Try an intermediate step. Sit on the side of your bed or in a straight-backed chair, and closing your eyes and relaxing all your muscles except those governing the diaphragm, breathe. Now stand, well poised. By well poised, of course you know I mean with the weight perfectly balanced about the centre of gravity, which in turn means that a perpendicular dropped from the highest point of the lifted chest without encountering any part of your body, and especially not your abdomen, which should be held always back, so that it is flat, if not actually concave, will fall unobstructed to the floor, striking a point just between the balls of your feet. Standing thus well poised, place the right hand on your body just below your ribs at the base of the lungs, and your left hand on your back just opposite your right hand. Then breathe, and feel the diaphragm as it descends, cause the torso in turn to expand from front to back, pressing against either hand. Let the breath go slowly, controlling its emission by controlling the diaphragm. So, the 3 exercises stand progressively thus. First, breathe naturally, which is diaphragmatically, 5 minutes at night. At first, you can be sure of doing this only by lying flat on your back. Second, breathe naturally, which is diaphragmatically, for 5 minutes in the morning, and note the sensation. Third, stand and test your newly acquired power by trying to breathe diaphragmatically while on your feet. These 3 exercises constitute the first step in the first stage of vocal training, and that step is called learning to support the tone. I know a little girl who, in the beginning of her career, alarmed her parents by refusing to utter a syllable, or the semblance of a syllable, until she was 3 years old, when she evidently considered herself ready for her maiden effort at speech. Prepared she proved, for sitting at the window in her high chair one day, watching people pass, she remarked quietly and with perfect precision, "There goes Mrs. Tibbets." I find myself secretly wishing it were possible for you to refrain from speech, not for 3 years, but for 3 weeks, while you quietly prepare for speech by practising these 3 breathing exercises. It is quite the customary thing for the teacher of voice as an instrument of song to require of the student a period of silence. That is, a period in which only exercises are allowed, and songs, even the simplest, are forbidden. However, our only way to secure this condition would be to go into retreat. But after all, one of the most encouraging things about this work is the remarkable effect upon the speaking voice of simply holding the thought of the right condition for tone, thinking the 3 exercises I have given you. It is not so remarkable, perhaps, in the light of the experiment recently made, I am told, in one of our great colleges, when 3 men daily performed a certain exercise, and 3 other men simply thought it intensely, and the resultant effect upon the muscles used in the act was marvellously similar. I am half afraid to have recalled this, lest you take advantage of the suggestion and relax your effort, or, out of curiosity, make the experiment. Please don't. I offer it only as an incentive to you to think at least of the desired condition, if you cannot every day indulge in an active effort to attain it. Please test at once the immediate effect of this 3rd exercise. Take the attitude I have defined, and try once more any full-vowelled syllable. I think you will find the tone already improved. End of Part 1, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Speaking Voice, Principles of Training, Simplified and Condensed, by Katherine Jewell Everts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Learning to free the tone. We have worked so far for support of tone. We must now free the supported tone by freeing the channel for the emission of the breath as it is converted into tone and moulded into speech. We shall find that in learning to support the tone we have gone far towards securing that freedom. But the habit of years is not easily overcome, and every time you have spoken without proper support of breath, you have forced the tone from the throat by tightening the muscles and closing the channel, thus making conditions which must now be reformed by steady, patient effort. Yet it is not effort I want from you now. It is lack of effort. It is passivity. It is surrender. I want you to relax all the muscles which govern the organs concerned in converting the breath into tone and moulding the tone into speech. All the muscles controlling the throat and mouth, including the lips and jaw. I want utter passivity of the parts from the point where the column of breath strikes the vocal cords to where, as tone, it is moulded into the word no. Surrender to the desire to utter that word. Concentrate your thought on 2 things, the taking of the breath and the word it is to become. Now, lying down or sitting easily, lazily in a comfortable chair, or standing leaning against the wall, with closed eyes, surrender to the thought no. And taking a breath, speak. Still hard and unmusical, you find? Yes, but I am sure not so hopelessly hard as before. What shall we do to relax the tense muscles, to release the throat and free the channel? At the risk of being written down a propagandist in the ranks of the extreme dress reformers, I shall say, first of all, take off those high, tight collars. Again, as with the corset, it is a case of a misfit rather than too tight a fit. If your collar is cut to fit, it need not be too high nor too tight for comfort, and it will still be becoming. You want it to cling to the neck and keep the line. Cut it to fit, and it will keep the line. Then put in pieces of whalebone if necessary, or resort to some of the many other devices now in vogue for keeping the soft collar erect. But don't choke yourself either by fastening it too tight or cutting it too high. But how simple it would be if we could relax the tension by doffing our ill-fitting corsets and collars. Alas, the trouble is deeper seated than that. It is an indisputable and most unfortunate fact that nervous tension registers itself more easily in the muscles about the mouth and throat than anywhere else. So, if we live as do even the children of to-day, under excitement, and so in a state of nervous tension, the habit of speaking with the channel only half open is quickly formed, and the voice becomes shrill and harsh. You have noticed that the more emphatic one grows in argument, the higher and harder the voice becomes, and, incidentally, the less convincing the argument. This is true of all excitement. The nervous tension accompanying it constricts the throat, and the result is a closed channel. To learn instinctively to refer this tension for registration not to the throat but to the diaphragm is a part of vocal training. This can be easily accomplished with children, and the habit established of taking a deep breath under the influence of any emotion. This breath will cause the throat to open instead of shut, and the tone to grow full, deep, and round, instead of high and harsh. The full, deep, round tone will carry twice as far as the high, harsh, breathy one. The one deep breath resulting in the full, deep tone may, nay will, often serve the same purpose as Tattycorum's "Count 5 and 20," and save the angry retort. It is useless to regret, on either ethical or aesthetic grounds, that we were not taught in childhood to take the deep breath and make the deep tone. But let us look to it that the voices and dispositions of our children are not allowed to suffer. Meanwhile, in correcting the fault in the use of our own instruments, we shall go far toward establishing the proper condition with the next generation, since the child is so mimetic that to hear sweet, quiet, low tones about him will have more effect than much technical training in keeping his voice free and musical. In the same way, the child who hears good English spoken at home seems less dependent upon textbook in grammar and rhetoric to perfect his verbal expression than the child who is not so fortunate in this respect. To ensure the registration of nervous tension in the muscles controlling the diaphragm and not the throat, that is, to form the habit of breathing deeply when speaking under the influence of emotion, is our problem. The present fault in registration will be found to be different with each one of us, or at least will cause us to flock together according to the place of registration. Each must locate for himself his own difficulty, or go to a vocal specialist and have it located. The tension may be altogether in the muscles governing the throat, or it may be in those about the mouth. There is the resultant breathy tone, the hard tone, the nasal tone, the guttural tone, the tone that issues from a set jaw or an unruly tongue. All mean tension of muscles somewhere, and must be met by relaxation of these muscles and the freeing of the channel. How to relax the throat shall be our initial point of attack. A suggestion made by my first teacher proved most helpful to me, a suggestion so simple that I did not for the moment take it seriously. "Think," she said, "how your throat feels just before you yawn." "Yes," I replied irrelevantly, "and just after you have eaten a peppermint, that cool, delicious, open sensation." This impressed her as significant, but not so effective as her suggestion to me, which I felt to be true when I began to think of it seriously, and so, of course, to yawn furiously. Try it. Think of the yawn. Close your eyes and feel how the deep breath with which the yawn begins, the need of which indeed caused it, opens the throat, relaxing all the muscles. Now, instead of yawning, speak. The result will be a good tone, simply because the condition for tone was right. The moment the yawn actually arrives, the condition is lost, the throat closes, but in that moment before the break into the yawn, the muscles about the throat relax and the channel opens, as the muscles controlling the diaphragm tighten and the deep breath is taken. These, then, are the first exercises in the second step in vocal training. This step is called freeing the tone. First, yawn, noting the sensation. Second, just before the throat breaks into the yawn, stop, and instead of carrying out the yawn, speak. Repeat this 50 times 3 times a day, or 20 times 5 times a day, or 10 times as often as you will. Only keep at it. Take always a single full-voweled monosyllable, one, or for, or no, or love, or loop, or dove, etc. We cannot, in this consideration, touch more in detail upon individual cases, but must confine ourselves to these simple exercises, which will, in general, be swiftly and effectively remedial. But we must not stop with the throat, which is but part of the channel involved in the emission of breath as speech. There is the tense jaw to be reckoned with, the jaw set by nervous tension, the jaw which refuses to yield itself to the moulding of the tone into the beautiful open vowel and the clean-cut consonant, which make our words so interesting to utter. It is the set jaw which, forcing the tone to squeeze itself out, causes it to sound thin and hard. Again, it is surrender and not effort I want. Just as I should try to secure the relaxation of your arm or hand by asking you to surrender it to me, drop it a dead weight at your side for me to lift as I choose, so now I ask you to surrender your lower jaw to yourself. Let it go. Drop your head forward, resting your chin on your chest. Then raise your head, but not your chin. Let your mouth fall open. Assume for the moment that mark of the feeble-minded, the idiotic, the dropped open mouth, just long enough to note the sensation. Place your fingers on either side of your head where the jaws conjoin, and open your mouth quickly and with intention. Note the action under your fingertips. Now let the mouth fall open by simply surrendering the lower jaw, and note this time the lack of action under your fingers at the juncture of the jaws. It is this passive surrender which we must learn to make if we find on investigation that we are speaking through a half-open mouth held fast by a set jaw. The set jaw resists and distorts the mould, and the beauty of the form of the word which flows from the mould is lost. The relaxed jaw yields to the moulding of the perfectly modelled word. In practising this relaxation, there is very little danger of going too far. since the set jaw is the indication of a tense habit of thought, of a high-strung temperament, and this habit of thought will never become, through the practice of an outward mechanical exercise, the slack habit of thought which is evidenced by the loose dropping of words from a too relaxed jaw, a habit which must be met by quite the opposite method of treatment. There are many exercises involved in vocal training which must be directed very carefully for a time before the student can be trusted to practice them alone, so I am confining myself in this, as in every step we take together, to the simple, fundamental, and at the same time perfectly safe ones. To review those for relaxation of the lower jaw: first, drop the head until the chin rests upon the breast. Raise the head, but not the lower jaw. Second, with eyes devoid of intelligence and the mouth dropped open, shake the head until you feel the weight of the lower jaw, until the lower jaw seems to hang loosely from the upper jaw and to be shaken by it, as your hand, when you shake it from the wrist, seems to be commanded by the arm and to have no volition of its own. Third, test your ability to surrender the jaw by placing your fingers on either side your head in front of the ears at the conjunction of the jaws, and first open your mouth with intention, noting the action. Then think the word "no," and surrender the jaw to the forming of the word, noting the action or absence of action again. So much for the set jaw. 10 or 15 minutes a day, yes, even 5 minutes a day of actual practice with the constant thought of surrender will reward you. Try it. And still the channel is not open. There remains that most unruly member, the tongue. The tongue which refuses to lie flat in the mouth, but insists on rising up when you speak and opposing itself in a little mound at the back of the mouth, over which or around which the tone must creep or be thrown back into the throat, instead of flowing over the flat, or better still, hollowed surface the tongue should make of itself, to issue an unobstructed column of tone into the mouth, to be moulded by the lips, teeth, and tip of the tongue into beautiful speech forms. This opposition of the back of the tongue must be fought patiently, persistently, and steadily, until the unruly member is conquered. Mirror in hand, stand with a good light on the open mouth. Now concentrate your eyes and thought on the back of the tongue. Then yawn, drinking in the breath, and with the tip of the tongue pressed against your teeth, let your thought suck down the back of the tongue until it forms a little hollow instead of the obstructing mound. If you find response slow to this treatment, if the thought down does not result in the concave tongue, touch the obstinate part with the tip of a pencil or any pointed instrument as you think the word ah. Now try the syllable la, 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 if necessary touching the tongue at the back as you speak. Nothing but patient, persistent practice, glass in hand, will carry us successfully past this point in our difficult task of freeing the channel. To put these directions in exercise form: first, yawn, thinking the back of the tongue down as you press the tip against your teeth. Second, touch the back of the tongue with a pencil as you think or even say ah. Third, try the syllable la, 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 thinking the back of the tongue down, or touching it if necessary. End of Part 1, Chapter 2. Of the Speaking Voice, Principles of Training, Simplified and Condensed, by Katherine Jewell Everts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Learning to Reinforce the Tone. And now we turn from the second step in the training to the third and last step, the reinforcing of the supported and freed tone. It is again a freeing process. This time we are to free the cavities now closed against the tone. We are to use the walls of these cavities as sounding boards for tone, as they were designed to be, so reinforcing the tone and letting it issue a resonant bell-like note with the carrying power resonance alone can give, instead of the thin, dull, colourless sound which conveys no life to the word into which it is moulded by the organs of speech. How shall we free these cavities? I find myself now impatient of the medium of communication we are using. I want to make the tone for you. I want, for instance, to shut off the nasal cavity and let you hear the resultant nasal note, thin, high, unresonant, which hardly reaches the first member of my audience. Then I want you to hear the tone flood into the nasal cavity, and, reinforced there by the vibration from the walls of the cavity, grow a resonant, ringing, bell-like note, which will carry to the farthest corner of the room without the least increase in loudness. But we must be content with the conditions imposed by print. First, you must realize that so-called talking through the nose is not talking through the nose at all, but rather failure to do so. That is, instead of letting the tone flood into the nasal cavity, to be reinforced there by striking against the walls of the cavity, which act as sounding boards for the tone confined within that cavity, we shut off the cavity and refuse the tone its natural reinforcement. It takes on, as a result, a thin, unresonant quality, which we call nasal, although it is thin and unpleasing because it lacks true nasal resonance. The only remedy lies in ceasing to shut off the cavity. Think the sound oo. Let the tone on which it is to be born grow slowly in thought, filling, and as it grows, flooding the whole face. Let it press against your lips, in thought only as yet. Feel your nostrils expand, your face grow alive between the eyes and the upper lip, that area so often inanimate, lifeless, even in a mobile, animated countenance. Now let the sound come, but let it follow the thought, flood the face. Let the nostrils expand. Feel the nasal cavity fill with sound. Let it go on up into the head and strike the forehead and the eye sockets and the walls of all the cavities so unused to the impact of sound, which should never have been shut out. Now begin with lips closed, a humming note. Let it come flooding into the face, until it presses against the lips, demanding the open mouth. Now let it open the mouth into the ah. Repeat this over and over. Ma, ma, ma. Don't let the tone drop back as the mouth opens. Keep it forward behind the upper lip, which it has made full, and which, playing against it, tickles until we must let the tone escape. Just as much of the day as possible, think the tone in a flood into the face, and as often as possible, hum and let it escape, noting its increasing resonance. It will increase in resonance, I promise you. It will lose its thin, high-pitched nasal quality and grow mellow and rich and ringing. And so, with chest lifted, diaphragm at work, throat open, tongue flat, jaws relaxed, and all the cavities concerned in vocalization open to the tone, as you breathe and yawn and hum, let it issue a full, round, resonant, singing note to add itself to the music of the world. End of Part 1, Chapter 3. Chapter 1 of The Speaking Voice, Principles of Training, Simplified and Condensed, by Katherine Jewell Everts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, The Technique of the Instrument, Chapter 1, Discussion. We leave, then, the question of the tuning of the instrument to turn to a consideration of its technique when tuned. I invite you to enter with me upon a study of the vocal interpretation of literature, through which, as I have said, the voice, put to its highest use, may be made the beautiful agent of personality it is intended to be. This term, vocal interpretation of literature, has been criticized as a sesquipedalian way of designating the good old-fashioned exercise, reading aloud. I wish the criticism were pertinent. It is not, because however identical in theory these exercises may be, in practice they are horribly opposed. So far apart are they indeed that we are told to beware of the reader who calls himself an interpreter. On the contrary, we should beware of the reader who has not established his claim to be an interpreter. The only excuse in the world for the existence of a reader lies in the possession of superior powers of interpretation. Unless I can make clear what must otherwise for some remain obscure, make beautiful what otherwise for some must remain commonplace, make alive what otherwise for some must lie dead on the printed page, I, as a reader, have no reason for being. To do any or all of these things is precisely to be an interpreter. However, we are entering upon this study of interpretation, not with the idea of becoming public readers, but with the intention of perfecting our voices. There is a theory that it is dangerous to go beyond the mere freeing of the instrument in either vocal or physical training. In accordance with this theory, I was advised by a well-known actress to confine my study for the stage, so far as the vocal and pantomimic preparation was concerned, to singing, dancing, and fencing. Get your voice and body under control, she said. Make them free, but don't connect shades of thought and emotion with definite tones of the voice or movements of the body. Don't meddle with Delsart or elocution. This advice seemed good at the time. It still seems to me that it ought to be the right method, but I have grown to distrust it. One of the chief sources of my distrust has been the effect of the theory upon the art of the actress who gave the advice. She is perhaps the most graceful woman on the stage to-day, and her voice is pure music. But her gestures and tones fail in lucidity. They fail to illumine the text of the part she essays to interpret. One grows suddenly impatient of the meaningless grace of her movements, the meaningless music of her voice. One longs for a swift, if studied, stride across the stage in anger, instead of the unstudied grace of her glide in swirling robed protest. One longs to hear a staccato declaration of intention, instead of the cadenced music of a voice guiltless of intention. No, after the body has been made a free and responsive agent, a mastery of certain fundamental laws, a mastery of certain principles of gesture in accordance with the dictates of thought and emotion, is necessary to its further perfecting as a vivid, powerful, and true agent of personality. The action must be suited to the word to the action, through a study of the laws governing expression in action. So with the voice. To become not only a free instrument, but a beautiful and powerful means of expression and communication, it must learn to recognize and obey certain fundamental laws governing its modulations. A master of verbal expression is distinguished by his vast vocabulary of words and his skill and discrimination in its use. A master of vocal expression must acquire what we may call a vocal vocabulary, consisting of changes of pitch, varieties of inflection, and variations in tone color, and must know how to use these elements with skill and discrimination. It is through a study of the vocal interpretation of literature that such a vocabulary is to be acquired. To learn to command at will the changes of pitch and variations of inflection and tone color which subtle shades of thought and feeling demand, is the final step to be mastered in training the voice. I have long held that a substitution of vocal interpretation of literature for a large proportion of the subjects now taught in our public schools would solve an equal proportion of the problems confronting our educators. I believe this study, properly conducted, involves the finest kind of mental, emotional, physical, and ethical discipline. I believe that a child put into training at 6, in a school which made this subject the beginning and end and main body of its curriculum, would find himself at 16 with mind disciplined, imagination untrammelled, emotions free, controlled, and unafraid, voice and body responsive agents, and with knowledge absolute, subject to no dispute, of his own bent, and an eager enthusiasm in pursuing it. Do not dismiss this as the extravagance of an enthusiast. At least reserve judgment until you have traced with me the process of transferring through the voice, vocally interpreting, real thought, literature, from the printed page to the mind of an auditor. The main object of the exercise will be, of course, to mark its effect upon the voice. But in order to establish the broader claim I am making for the study, I ask you to consider as well the mental, emotional, and ethical training involved. It would indeed be difficult to study one without the other, since it is the play of an elastic mind, controlled emotion, and a quickened spirit upon the voice, which is to make the free and responsive instrument an effective agent. It is through the process of which we are about to make a study that the mind is made elastic, the emotions set free, and the spirit quickened. It is the act of intense concentration and strong transition demanded of the mind by this process which will deepen and broaden its action. It is the swift response and perfect control demanded of the emotions by this process which will steady and free their play. It is the constant dwelling in an atmosphere of truth and beauty demanded of the spirit by this process which will quicken its life. These effects upon mind, heart, soul, and voice are simultaneous, and cannot be separated out in our study of the act which produces them. Then, in entering upon this step in vocal training, let us mentally drive a four in hand. We must begin by choosing a passage for interpretation. What shall govern our choice? It must be a passage worth interpreting, or we shall not be dealing with literature, and so shall not meet the requirements of our title. To be worth interpreting, it must possess one, or combine all, of these three attributes: beauty, truth, and power. And here at once, as a point in our minor claim, note the ethical training demanded of the student by this subject. Surely to dwell appreciatively many hours of each day in an atmosphere charged with beauty, truth, and power is to be quickened spiritually, or to be a dull clod indeed. How will this passage from Emerson's essay on Friendship do for our experiment? Our friendships hurry to short and poor conclusions, because we have made them a texture of wine and dreams instead of the tough fibre of the human heart. It is certainly truth, beautifully and powerfully expressed. Surely it will serve. And here I should like to stop and discuss with you that vital question of choosing literature for children according to temperament and age, but another time perhaps. Having read the passage under consideration cursorily, as is the custom in reading to oneself to-day, will you now study it for a moment very closely? Now, once more, please, read it silently, noting the action of your mind as you read. Watch its pulsations, Dr. Curry would say. And now, aloud, although without an auditor, read it, this time noting the effect of the action of the mind upon your voice. Did its pitch change? Where and why? How did you inflect the words wine and dreams? How did the inflection of these words differ from that of the last 6 words, tough fibre of the human heart, with which they are contrasted in thought? Did your tone change colour at any point? Why? Where? But now, once more, let us approach the passage, this time with a different intention. Let us study it with the idea of interpreting it for another mind. Now the method of attack is very different. Not that it ought to be different, but it is. Intense concentration ought to characterize all our reading, whether its object be to acquire knowledge or pleasure for oneself, or to impart either to another. But the day of reading which "maketh a full man" seems to be long past, so far as the general public is concerned. The necessity of skimming the pages of a dozen fourth-rate books of the hour, in order to be at least a lucid interlocutor, and so a desired dinner guest, is making our reading a swift gathering of colourless impressions which may remain a week or only a day, and which leave no lasting effect of beauty or truth upon the mind and heart of the reader. Should it not be rather an intense application of the mind to the thought of a master mind, until that thought, in all its power and beauty, has broadened the boundaries of the reader's mind, and enlarged the meaning of all his thoughts? I wonder if a much smaller proportion of time spent in such reading might not result in a less bromidic social atmosphere, even though its tendency were a bit serious. Who knows? But let us return to Emerson on friendship. In studying this thought for the purpose of interpreting it vocally, the concentration of the attention must be intense, because I must make it absolutely my own before I can present it to you. It must, for the moment, possess me. It must seem, for the time, to be a creation of my own brain. It must belong to me as only the created thing can. Until I have so recreated the thought, it is not mine to give. Now read the passage silently, with this idea of making it your own. Pour upon it the light of your experience, your philosophy, your ideals, your perception of truth. Comment upon it silently as you read. Now read it aloud, and let your voice do this commenting. But wait a moment. Let me quote for you the paragraph following this statement. The laws of friendship are austere and eternal, of one web with the laws of nature and of morals. But we have aimed at a swift and petty benefit to suck a sudden sweetness. We snatch at the slowest fruit in the whole garden of God, which many summers and many winters must ripen. This is Emerson's paraphrase of his original statement. How much of it did your mental commentary include? How did your silent paraphrase resemble this? Read the original passage again to yourself in the light of this paraphrase. I shall ask you now to repeat the first sentence from memory, for you will find, after this concentrated contemplation of a thought, that its form is fixed fast in your mind. That is a delightful accompaniment of this kind of reading. The form of the thought, if it be apposite, which it must be to be literature, and we are considering only literature. The form of a thought so approached stays with us in all its beauty. Let us then repeat the original statement, having read the passage in which Emerson has elaborated it. Now, what you must demand of your voice is this: that it shall so handle the single introductory sentence as to suggest the rest of the paragraph. In other words, your voice must do the paraphrasing by means of its changes in pitch, its inflections, and its variations in tone color. Once more, read the sentence casually as you did at first, as a mere statement of fact, and then again in this paraphrastical manner. Watch, watch, watch the voice. Mark the growth of its light and shade with the second reading. We must not lose sight of our minor claim, but the mental and ethical training involved has been too obvious, I am sure, to have escaped us. We need go back for but a moment to re-note it. The intense concentration and strong transition of thought required of the mind in mastering a text for the purpose of interpretation afford keen intellectual exercise. The underlying idea in approaching a passage full of truth and beauty, that the knowledge or pleasure I gain from it is not for the purpose of self-gratification, but that I may share it with another, is of great ethical value. Especially is this true in teaching children the laws of vocal expression. End of Part 2, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Speaking Voice, Principles of Training Simplified and Condensed, by Katherine Jewell Everts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Study in Change of Pitch. Let us now confine our work to a study in change of pitch, which is the fundamental element of the vocal vocabulary we are endeavouring to acquire. Had I an actual class before me, I should now divide your voices into groups according to the varying degrees of greyness. As it is, I must treat you all as monotones. For our present purpose we should choose a passage which, to be intelligently interpreted, demands marked changes of pitch. Robert Browning affords the best material of this kind, because of his sudden and long-sustained parentheses, which can be handled lucidly by the voice only after it has mastered this fundamental element of a vocal vocabulary. Let us take the first stanza and the first line of the second stanza of Abbot Vogler. Would that the structure brave, the manifold music I build, bidding my organ obey, calling its keys to their work, claiming each slave of the sound at a touch, as when Solomon willed armies of angels that soar, legions of demons that lurk. Man, brute, reptile, fly, alien of end and of aim, adverse, each from the other heaven high, hell deep removed, should rush into sight at once as he named the ineffable name, and pile him a palace straight to pleasure the princess he loved. Would it might tarry like his, the beautiful building of mine! Remember, we are to confine our consideration to the one point, change of pitch, not the change of pitch within a word, which is inflection and belongs to another chapter, but to the broad changes of pitch from word to word, phrase to phrase, sentence to sentence, following the intricate changes of the thought. With this end in mind, let us first blaze a trail through this forest of ideas. Let us find the main road and then trace the bypaths which lead away from that main road, and in this case, fortunately, come back to it again, which does not always happen in Mr. Browning's woody tracts of thought. To employ a better figure for vocal purposes, let us cut off the stream, the voice, and trace the bed of this river of thought, following the main channel and then its branches. We find the main channel cut by the first and last lines. Would that the structure brave, the manifold music I build, Would it might tarry like his, the beautiful building of mine. All between, beginning with the second line, bidding my organ obey, and including the last words of the 8th line, the princess he loved, is a branch channel, leading away from and coming back to the main river's bed. But this branch channel is interrupted in turn by its own branch leading away from it and returning with it to join the main bed with the last line we quote. This second branch begins in the middle of the 3rd line with the words, "as when Solomon willed," wanders in this course for 5 lines, and rejoining the first offshoot, returns to the main channel with the last line. Now let us turn on the stream, the voice, and watch it flow into the course as traced. What happens? Dropping the figure, the voice starts on a certain pitch determined by the atmosphere of the main thought, modified by the parentheses. If the main thought were not interrupted, the original pitch might be much lower. But we must make allowance for the necessity of dropping the voice for each of the 2 parentheses. We must therefore start on a comparatively high pitch, from which we may depart easily at the end of the first line, where the secondary thought begins, and to which we return after a second drop with the last line, which resumes the main thought. Let us try this. Carry the exact pitch with which you start over the parentheses, and begin the last line on the original pitch. Can you do it? If you can, you are not a monotone. But you may need the exercise just the same, for there are many degrees of dullness in tone. Now let us take up the parentheses. The first one begins with the second line. The voice must drop on the words "bidding my organ obey" to a lower pitch, indicating instantly the interruption of the thought. Hold this pitch through the second line and until the last 4 words of the 3rd line. With these words, "as when Solomon willed," the voice falls upon the second interruption, which it must denote by a corresponding second drop in pitch. This it pursues until it reaches the last line, where it resumes the original pitch with the original thought. Try this. These are only the broad changes from sentence to sentence. There are lesser changes from phrase to phrase, partly for the sake of variety alone, as in the 2nd and 3rd lines, where the pitch changes after obey, runs through the next 6 words, calling its keys to their work, and returns again on "claiming each slave of the sound." There is also a momentary lift of the voice on the 3 words "at a touch," dropping to the second broad change with the next words, "as when Solomon willed." Try this more detailed treatment of the first parenthesis. Taking up the second interruption for this closer study, the parenthesis begins with the last 3 words of the 3rd line, as we have said. The voice, starting with this second drop in pitch, plays about the level of that pitch from phrase to phrase through 5 lines, but it also changes from word to word, as on the 4 closing the 5th line, "man," "brute," "reptile," "fly," and this time merely for the sake of variety. Remember, whatever the departure, it must always follow the parenthetical thought, bringing it back by resuming the original pitch, from which it departed to indicate the interruption. Will you not diagram these 9 lines? Simply write the verse as prose, and then mark it for change of pitch. Call the original pitch C, the first broad change B, the second broad change A. Denote the changes within the parentheses by sharps and flats. For instance, would not the pitch of the last 3 words of the second line be indicated correctly by marking it B sharp? But do not stop with the diagram. Begin and end by testing the voice. Make it follow the changes you indicate on the diagram until it masters the subtlest of them. Through such practice alone can you hope to increase the light and shade upon which the voice depends for its final beauty as an agent of personality. End of Part 2, Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Speaking Voice, Principles of Training Simplified and Condensed, by Katherine Jewell Everts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Chapter 3, Study in Inflection. To me, the most notable among the many notable elements in Madame Alla Nazimova's marvellous acting is her illumination of the text of her impersonations through inflection. To an ear unaccustomed to the broken music of her speech, a word may now and then be lost because of her still faulty English, but of her attitude toward the thought she is uttering, or the person she is addressing, or the situation she is meeting, there can never be a moment's doubt. So illuminating is the inflectional play of her voice. The tone she uses is not to me pleasing in quality. It does not fall in liquid, alluring cadences upon the ear, as does Miss Marlowe's, for instance. It is always keyed high, whether the child-wife Nora or Hedda, omnivorous of experience, is speaking. But this high-pitched tone is endlessly volatile. It is restless. It never lets your attention wander. It is never monotonous. It is a master of inflection. Madame Nazimova's emotion is always primarily intellectual. It always proceeds from a mind keenly alive to the instant's incident. This intensely intellectual temperament reveals itself through her voice in a rare degree of inflectional agility. This element alone makes her work, to me, more stimulating than any I have ever known, except Madame Douze's. Recall the revelation of Nora's soul in her cry, "It is not possible! It is not possible!" Madame Nazimova's conception of the mistress of the doll's house is concentrated in these 4 words, in her inflection of the last word, I may almost say. When I close my eyes and think of Madame Nazimova's voice, I see a grove of soft maples in early October with the sun playing upon them, while Miss Marlowe's tone carries me at once into the pine woods, where a white birch now and then shimmers its yellow leaves. Again, the voice of the Russian actress suggests a handful of diamonds, and the American instrument a set of turquoise in the matrix. The difference in these 2 agents of 2 compelling personalities is, of course, the result of a difference in the 2 temperaments, but undoubtedly it also arises from a difference in methods of training. Whatever the temperament, light and shade can be developed in the voice through practice of inflection, and whatever the temperament, a pure tone can be secured through a mastery of support of breath and freedom of vocal conditions. The voices of these 2 actresses vividly illustrate these 2 points. We have studied how to secure Miss Marlowe's tone. We are now to work for Madame Nazimova's light and shade, so far as a mastery of inflection will secure it. How shall we proceed? "All my life," writes Ellen Terry in her entrancing memoirs, "the thing which has struck me as wanting on the stage is variety. Some people are tone deaf, and they find it physically impossible to observe the law of contrasts. But even a physical deficiency can be overcome by that faculty of taking infinite pains." That is the secret of successful acquisition in any direction, is it not? The faculty of taking infinite pains. With Ellen Terry it resulted in a voice which in its prime estate suggested, it is said, all the riotous colours of all the autumns, or Henry Ward Beecher's most varied collection of precious stones. We can secure an approximate result by employing the same method. Let us proceed with infinite pains to practise, practise, practice inflection. Let us first examine this change of pitch within a word, which we call inflection. How does the pitch change, and why, and what does the change indicate? We have discovered that a change of thought results in a broad change of pitch from word to word, phrase to phrase, sentence to sentence, and we shall discover that a change in emotion results in a change in the colour of the tone we are using. But this element of our vocal vocabulary, inflection, is subtler than either of the other two. While change of pitch is an intellectual modulation, and variation in tone colour is an emotional modulation, inflection, in a degree, combines both. It is a change in both colour and key within the word. It is primarily of intellectual significance, but it also reveals certain temperamental characteristics which cannot be disassociated with emotion. For instance, the staccato utterance of Mrs. Fiske is technically the result of her use of straight, swift-falling inflections, but it is temperamentally the result of thinking and feeling in terms of Becky Sharp. Let us see how inflections vary. They rise and fall swiftly or slowly. They move in a straight line from point to point, or make a curve. The latter we call circumflex inflection. They make various angles with the original level of pitch, rising or falling abruptly or gradually. These are some of the variations, each indicating an attitude of the mind and heart of the speaker toward the thought, or toward the one spoken to, or toward the circumstances out of which the speech arises. All must be mastered for use at will, if light and shade are to be developed in the voice. Now let us take a phrase or sentence and voice it under a certain condition, noting the inflection of the word or words which hold the thought of the phrase or sentence in solution. Then let us change the condition and again voice the thought, noting the change in inflection. Let me propound again the profound question asked in our first lesson: do you like growing old? The answers will all be yes or no. But what of the inflection of those monosyllabic words? Sweet 16 will employ a straight, swift-falling inflection on the affirmative, unless some untoward influence, such as Love the Destroyer, has embittered her life, when she may give us one of May Iverson's adorable replies, masked in indifference and circumlocution. 20 will employ the straight-falling inflection without the swiftness of Sweet 16's slide. With 25 we detect a faint sign of a curve in the more gradual fall. 28 to 35 employs various degrees of circumflex, according to the desire or possibility of concealing the real facts. 40 to 45, if in defiant mood, employs the abrupt falling inflection, or, if quite honest, changes to the negative with as swift and straight a fall. This lasts through 65, and at 70 we hear a new and gentle circumflex on the no, until the pride of extreme old age sets in at 85 with the swift fall of 16's affirmative. Were it not expedient to maintain friendly relations with one's printer, I should venture to diagram these changes of tone within a word. As it is, I shall content myself with advising you to do so. It is my privilege to have had acquaintance with a woman who was a personal friend of Emerson. Among the incidents of his delightful talk to her, retold to me, I recall one which bears upon our present problem. They were discussing mutual friends on the shelf. "Have you ever read Titan?" asked the gentle seer. "Yes," replied the lady. "Read it again," said he. Query to the class: how did the lady inflect the word "yes" to call forth the injunction, "Read it again"? What did her inflection reveal? However inclined we may be to quarrel with Bernhardt's conception of the Duke of Reichstadt, we can never forget her disclosure of the eaglet's frail soul through inflection, as she crushes letter after letter in her hand and tosses them aside, uttering the single word "destroyed," and the final revelation in the quick, thrilling curve of her wonderful voice on the same word, as the little cousin leaves the room at the close of this episode of the letters. No better material can be chosen for a study of inflection than the paragraph from Emerson's Friendship, quoted in a preceding chapter. Let us repeat the first sentence again. Our friendships hurry to short and poor conclusions because we have made them a texture of wine and dreams instead of the tough fibre of the human heart. Study, in voicing this, how to illumine the thought by your contrastive inflection of the words wine and dreams and tough fibre of the human heart. A lingering circumflex cadence in uttering the first two words will suggest the unstable nature of a friendship woven out of so frail a fabric as wine and dreams, while a swift, strong, straight-falling inflection on each of the last 6 words indicates the vigorous growth of a love rooted in the tough fibre of the human heart. In Monna Vanna, Maurice Maeterlinck gives the actress a superb opportunity to show her mastery of inflection. Let us turn to the scene in Prinzivalle's tent. Prinzivalle: Are you in pain? Vanna: No. Will you let me have it, her wound, dressed? No. Pause. You are decided? Yes. Need I recall the terms of the... It is useless. I know them. Your lord consents? Yes. It is my mind to leave you free. There is yet time, should you desire to renounce. No. And so the seeming inquisition proceeds. To each relentlessly searching interrogation from Gianello comes Vanna's unfaltering reply in a single swift monosyllable, yes or no. The same word, but oh, the revelation which may lie in the inflection of that word! Let us try it. Let us read the scene aloud, first giving as nearly as possible the same inflection to each of Vanna's answers, then let us voice it again, putting into the curve of the tone within the narrow space of the 2 or 3 lettered monosyllables all the concentrated mental passion of Vanna's soul in its attitude toward the terrible situation and toward the man whom she believes to be her enemy. This is a most difficult exercise, but if a man's reach should exceed his grasp, it will not retard our progress toward the goal of a vocal vocabulary to attempt it now. Apart from all aim in its pursuit, there is no more fascinating study than this study of inflection. In this day of artistic photography, there is an endless interest for the artist of the camera in playing with a subject's expression by varying the light and shade thrown upon the face. So, for the student of vocal expression, there is endless interest in this play with the thought behind a group of words by varying the inflection of those words. Lady Macbeth's "We fail!" or Macbeth's "If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly," occurs to us, of course, as rich material for this exercise. In her analysis of the character of Lady Macbeth, Mrs. Jameson gives us an interesting study in inflection based on Mrs. Siddons's interpretation of the words "we fail." A footnote reads, "In her impersonation of the part of Lady Macbeth, Mrs. Siddons adopted successively 3 different intonations in giving the words 'we fail.' At first a quick, contemptuous interrogation, 'We fail?' Afterward, with the note of admiration, 'We fail!' and an accent of indignant astonishment, laying the principal emphasis on the word 'we.' 'We fail!' Lastly, she fixed on what I am convinced is the true reading: "We fail," with the simple period, modulating the voice to a deep, low, resolute tone, which settled the issue at once, as though she had said, "If we fail, why then we fail, and all is over." Think how vitally the total impersonation is affected by your choice of inflections at this point. Compare the effects of the three Mrs. Siddons tested. Are there other possible intonations of the words? What are they? Do you realize the vital effect upon the voice of such vocal analysis and experimentation? Devote 10 minutes of the time you take for reading each day to this phase of vocal interpretation, and at the end of a week note its effect upon your silent reading and upon your voice. Remember, with inflection, as with every other phase of the training, the greatest immediate benefit will come from holding the question of its peculiar significance constantly in mind. Study the temperament of the people about you by noting this element in their speech. Study the attitude of every interlocutor you face by studying the inflection of his replies to the questions of life and death you propound. But above all, study your own use of this element. Do not let your own attitude go undetected. It may help you to alter an unfortunate attitude, to realize its effect upon your own voice. End of Part 2, Chapter 3.